Okay, so today we're working with this image here in front of us. It is tilted. It is kind of yellowish green and it has quite a few blemishes around in this kind of white crease on the, or white hair on one side. It has a bunch of little dots all over the place and a very big crease running down the whole image. So we're going to be getting rid of those blemishes and creases. We're straightening the image. And we're also going to get rid of this guy by learning how to use some of the um, image correction tools. So we are going to start with our cropping tool, and that should be let's see. There's our cropping tool, right? See? And one of the things that we want to make sure is that in terms of the dimensions, the WH and resolution, so width, height, and resolution, is set for the size of the image that we want to result in or that we're working with. So we don't want to mess too much with the resolution. If you have an image that you're working with and it's at 300 pixels per inch, then leave it at 300. I want this image to be at 7 inches by 7 inches, so I want to preserve the square, and I do want to preserve the 200 pixels per inch resolution so that I have nice clean pixels to work with, plenty of them to work with as I'm making changes further on. So as soon as I click on my cropping tool, you'll see this frame pop up, and that will allow me to crop things down. But before I get that there, I want to straighten this image out. So I'm going to click on this level tool, the straightening tool, and I am going to find a spot where I'm going to start in terms of leveling the image. And I'm going to click and hold with the mouse, and I will get a line that I can run across an area that I want to make parallel or straight compared to the top of my frame. So as soon as I let go, the image will snap to parallel, or as parallel as I made it. So this looks pretty parallel right now, and I'm gonna crop my image by dragging the frame back and forth till I get it to the right area so that it's nicely cropped. Now you can also move around because the move tool has appeared while we're cropping so that it is nicely sitting in the middle. You can also use your keys. I'm pressing the keyboard keys right now to move the image up and down to be a little more precise because it's moving it about a few pixels at a time. Once I have everything set, click enter on my keyboard and it will snap into the cropped area that I made it into. So that's cropping, and that will work for any kind of cropping, whether you want to crop only a section of the image or the whole image to make it nice and clean like we did just now. I'm going to zoom in a little bit as I'm going to start working on other areas of the image. So next thing I'm going to do is work on the color and brightening up the image a little bit. Last time we used brightness and contrast, and we worked with hue and saturation, and that could work, but we're going to use a couple of different tools to get us to similar effect and maybe even better in terms of what we're working with here. So for this activity, we're going to use curves, and that looks at the variety of different tones within the image itself. So I can play with these curves if I want to, but it's probably better that we look at the whiteness and the darkness of this image. So a well-balanced image will have a nice neutral white, and it will have a nice black in it. So this image is kind of flat across. It has a good layer of gray kind of on top of it, muting the colors. So we're going to try to find a white, and I am going to go to the white point tool, which is this little eyedropper, third one from the top in our properties panel. I'm going to click on it, and I'm going to look for an area in the image that has a neutral white. What that means, it's bright, but it also isn't something like a light or sunlight, a direct light source, something that is just blown out, but that it is kind of something that would exist in the nature. Now, this area on the girl's shirt is pretty bright. So what I'm going to do is click on it and brighten up the entire image as it relates to the brightness of that area of the shirt. This is probably, yeah, that's good here. And you can see automatically the entire image has brightened up to be nicely relative to the neutral white that is in this image. We still want to work on the darkness of the image because it does look like there's some nice dark areas, but again, a balanced image will have darks in terms of blacks and whites in it. So we want to go to levels. And here we have these adjustment little arrows that allow us to move around the black area of the image. That allows us to work with the midtones or the grays of the image. And then also allows us to play with the brights if we want to. It's just a different way of working with brightness and contrast, but a little more precise, I think, in some ways. So I'm going to move this little black adjustment tool just a tiny bit. And I'm getting really nice dark shadow here. And I like that. So I still want to work with some of the midtones and darken those guys up a little bit. So we'll move it a little bit to the right. Again, these are sometimes your preferences, so you can just leave them as is or change them up according to what your preferences are. So what I need to do now, I have the coloring the way I want it to, but I now need to move on to the blemishes and creases and removing the areas that I don't want to keep in the image. Now, in order to do that, I need to flatten these layers. I want them all essentially to be a background, the opposite of what we've been learning so far, but it just makes working with these kind of imperfections a little easier and faster. So I am going to go to layers at the top of our screen and scoot down to flatten image, and that will take all the layers and make them into one background. So the next thing I'm going to go to is the spot healing brush tool up here, J. It will select it, and this will allow me to remove areas while copying sections of the image around what I am removing. So what we want to make sure is that we are zooming in on the area that we're going to work with, especially if it's a small fine area like the crease that's running down our image. And we want to adjust the size of the brush that we're using. Right now, this brush is a little bit too small for the crease. We want the brush to be just a tiny bit bigger than the crease there, or the spots that we're working with. You don't want it to be too big because then it will copy big chunks of things that are around the brush and it will not look seamless. You do want to make sure that you have selected content aware because you want the brush to be aware of the content around it so that it can accordingly copy it. So once I have that set, I am going to click on the areas that I want to brush over or heal over and just drag my mouse across it. It looks like it's painting a black line, but that's just telling me this is where your brush is going. As soon as I unclick, the result is there, right? The image has been healed and corrected. And I can continue to do that. As long as that brush is not much bigger than what we are trying to heal or correct, it should be okay for what we're doing. If my brush was bigger than this little foresty area or bigger than the bridge, it would not be copying it as seamlessly or as nicely and cleanly as I would like it to. So right now, pretty good. And you'll see what I mean as soon as I get to this little stone area. Once I brush over it, it picks up whatever's around it and has painted over it. I want to be a little more precise with that, so I'm going to take a step back, press Ctrl Z on my keyboard, and make that brush a little bit smaller so that I can work a little bit finer around that area. So I can correct around the edge of the stone, or around the divot of the stone, and then slowly work into the area so that I can almost preserve the look of the divot. Oops, went a little too far. Take a couple steps back. And I can do the rest of this crease to the bottom of the image. And that kind of healed it pretty nicely. Now there are other areas in this image. If you sometimes have to zoom in to see blemishes like these spots here that I can easily fix with the healing brush tool. There's this white hair that I can pretty easily remove with this tool. So I'm going to now apply the patch tool, and that tool is hidden right now. It is J, if you remember from our first handout, and it is hidden under the spot healing brush tool. So I would right click on my tool and find the patch tool to work with. This tool will allow me to remove a section of the image, and I'm going to remove this guy on the right completely out of the image and replace him with the area that I drag him to. So let's do that now. I'm going to click with my mouse and drag sort of a line around where he is. I'm looking out for the shadows because I don't want them to stay very clear on the when I actually remove him. I don't want to just remove him and leave his shadow there. That will look very strange. And it'll clearly point to something that it was in the area previously. So now you see this marquee or the marching ants walking around him. I know that he's going to be moved. And in this case, what I want to do is drag his section. So I click and hold with my mouse and drag his section to another area that I want to copy into the spot that he's in. That's one way of doing it. And another way of doing it is just simply delete him out of the area. So I can just, again, delete him, and the system or the app will figure out what to blend into the area, or, oops, there we go, or you can find an area that you can kind of fill in and decide on your own what you actually want to fill in, because you might want to I don't know, duplicate the girl or something along those lines, right? You could do that. I prefer just deleting some of these areas. Sometimes it's a little bit easier. And then Control D to remove the marching ants. Now, this has copied things pretty well. It can still be refined and fixed to make it look even better, including this area of the wall. You can see that the app has repeated some of the curves a little too uniformly, at least for my liking, and the edge of the wall isn't perfectly straight as it kind of is here. It just looks like it actually you can tell that something has been removed. So to fix that, I'm going to use our clone stamp tool, and that is S on our keyboard. So what this tool does is allows us to select an area in an image and then copy it into another section of the image. It's a little more finicky and it is a little more precise than the tools we just used, the patch and the content aware remove spot healing brush. But in some ways you control what the content is that is going in there a little more, a little better than you would with the other two tools. So I would say use this tool sparingly because it can get a little messy at times. So what I would do is hover my mouse over an area that I want to copy, press Alt and click. Oops, no, that's not what I was looking for. Alt, and you'll have this kind of like a bullseye come in, and click on the area that you want to copy or stamp, and then that area will start appearing into other sections where you can drag it in and paint it. So you see a circle and a cross. The circle is what's being painted on, and the cross is what's being painted in that circle. So I am dragging that across and painting sort of like a cleaner, straighter line. I can use that anywhere on my wall. The distance stays the same no matter where I move my tool. So if I want to make this like another little dent, I've copied this area into here just to give it a little bit of lightness. I can refine that. Let's say I wanted this lighter area now in here. I'm going to do another Alt push of the mouse and paint that lighter area in here. Like that. And I can keep going to refine my image as best as I can, or as much as I want to. This will come in handy in when we have patterns and we want to repeat them, like up here in our building. I want these columns to continue on to fill them in a little more consistently so that it looks like an actual pattern. So Alt click on the areas that I want to repeat here. So I'm going to paint that section in. And there we go. So that it actually looks like the building is continuing into this section, which it probably is or was behind that man. Just weren't exposed to it earlier. And yeah. And again, do that for the areas that you want to fill in. Be careful with that because sometimes this tool can get a little repetitive, as you notice that it's really repeating that area faithfully, and takes a bit of finessing and working with it to get things to look the way you want them to look. I definitely want this fence to kind of continue, so here too. here. And kind of drag it across as best. Maybe let it meet from this side. Okay. And yes, I did want to fix this wall a little bit because it's a little too uniform. There we go. Yeah, I like that better. And Control 0 to see the full image. The guy is gone. It's not perfect, but if you didn't know the guy was there before, it doesn't make any difference to your eye, especially from further away. Had my resolution been lower than 200 ppi that we had earlier, this would have been more difficult to do because I would have had fewer pixels to work with to recreate what we were seeing in the first place. So the last thing that we want to work on is to sharpen the image, because some of these images are old and they were taken with vintage cameras. They tend to be a little blurrier, and I want it to be a little less blurry, to look a little sharper, look a little cleaner. So I am going to go to filters at the top of our screen and sharpen. You can use these guys a little bit at a time. I prefer the Smart Sharpen because it allows us to really control what we are sharpening. And so this is already sharpening the image a little bit. But one of the things that I want to be careful about is the artifacts that exist in the image, like in the boy's shirt. And there's a lot of these artifacts all over the place in the older photographs, and sometimes even the newer ones. And all it is dust that's kind of stayed on the image, or lighter areas that are coming up in some kind of like bluish images or pixels. And sharpening can amplify and make them even greater. So what I'm looking at here right now is the image as it's sharpened in here. I have the preview on. If I didn't have the preview on, there we go. This is what would be happening. This is our original image, and I can have this blown up area of his shirt that I can play with and make sure that I don't have too many artifacts blowing up and getting too big for me and too obvious once you sharpen the image. So I am going to, it's still visible, but when I turn the preview back on, I can now see how much this image has been sharpened, how much of the artifacts are being exposed, and I can kind of adjust it and play with it a little bit. You want to change the amount, which is the amount that you're sharpening by, at 100. This is our original. So that would be our original image. Now we're going to sharpen change the radius of the pixels that need to be sharpened. And I'm going to reduce some of that noise that is existent in the image. So I can see how much of these artifacts are coming up and how sharper the image is before, or is now, versus if I click on preview, before. So it's sharpened up a little bit, maybe just a tiny bit more. Increase the radius a little bit more of the pixels, which will then make them sharper. And yeah, that looks much better. Use that preview, click and unclick to see what you're doing and how much you're changing your original image. And that's pretty good for me. The only thing is make sure that you have this lens blur option on so that you're getting a nice reduction in noise when you're playing with the sharpen tool. Click OK and Control S to save our file. And that's it. That is our finished, cleaned up image.